Hello, and welcome to the Who Do You Think You Are module. We're going to be carrying on with the class and community case study this week, focusing on the social and economic history of Liverpool, and more specifically, how the ideas of what a Scouser was changed following the destructive Second World War, which left Liverpool physically and metaphorically in ruins. But to understand how Liverpool changes politically and socially in the 40s and 50s, we have to look at the wider national political situation in Britain. And what you need to understand about how Britain changed in this time period is you have a massive shift from right to left. Winston Churchill had been a hero to many Britons throughout the Second World War for the way in which he tackled the growing imperial powers of Germany, Italy, and Germany. However, after the war had finished, many people speculated that Churchill would not be an effective peacetime leader. And the Labour Party led a very effective campaign highlighting how conservative governments were unlikely to invest money in industries and poor communities that had been decimated by the Second World War. And there is a huge swelling in popularity for the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, who promised to revolutionise the way Britain worked and introduce social welfare and social reforms. And in 1942, there had been a report called the Beveridge Report, which highlighted where Britain needed investment, and Labour promised to invest in those areas. And in a massive surprise to many political commentators, Attlee becomes Prime Minister in 1945 and begins to introduce a series of radical, at the time, reforms. So, in 3 years after Attlee reaches the position of Prime Minister, he begins to give freedom to the colonies throughout the world, which had become an economic drain on Britain. But he promoted the moral freedom of those communities as well. In 1945, he passes the Family Allowances Act, which gives money to poor communities. He gives workers increased rights. The Industrial Injuries Act is passed in 46, and the National Insurance Act is passed in the same year as well. So workers are increasingly getting rights. Poorer families are getting increased payments to help support them. The New Towns Act is passed to create entire new areas for people to move to. And there is also huge rejuvenation in different cities as well. The National Health Service is set up, and the National Assistance Act is as well. So you can see all of these acts are set up to help support people, the returning soldiers, and the ailing industries of the United Kingdom. And this helps enormously in a lot of parts of the UK. However, in Liverpool, where there had been a disproportionate level of physical destruction, there wasn't an adjustment made to give additional support to Liverpool. And as a result of that, the city continued to struggle throughout the late 40s and the 50s. What you get is, because Attlee had severed ties with much of the empire, lots of the trade left Liverpool. Many of the ports that had been destroyed were only partially rebuilt, which meant that the dock workers, who were the stereotypical scousers who used to eat the bowls of labscouse, were left without jobs. The population of Liverpool nearly halves in the 1950s and goes as low as 460,000 when it had reached between 8 and 900,000 in the early 1900s. As a result of the lack of opportunities, The economic migrants who had moved to Liverpool go to other areas to find jobs. There are no prospects in the city. Businesses and manufacturing and shipbuilding companies also leave Liverpool. And of course, this means that the soldiers who had been fighting in the World War come back to very few job prospects. There is also a housing shortage, so homelessness becomes a real problem as Liverpool becomes a real problem in Liverpool as well. But of course, soldiers and men returning also means that there's going to be a baby boom. As a result of that, you have lots of men with undiagnosed post traumatic stress conditions returning to no jobs, having children to support. And as a result of this, rationing continues in the poorest areas of Liverpool. And what you get in this time period is Liverpool becomes to be perceived by other parts of the country as a drain on the country. And this is where you get the beginnings of negative stereotypes about Scousers in particular. And you still see this on social media and at football games as well. The phrase bin dippers is often thrown at Liverpool fans because they are being portrayed as people who need to scavenge and rely on state welfare. And throughout the 50s and 60s, we look at people from Liverpool who have written their own biographies, and what you get is them talking about playing in bomdies. And a bomdie is just the shells of bombs that were left in abandoned buildings in Liverpool, and we see this in a lot of accounts. So even by the 60s, there are still the physical ramifications and memories of the war. These are not cleaned up. Lots of buildings remain in a state of utter disrepair. So Liverpool becomes an economically destructive place to live. And when once at the height of empire, people moved there for prospects, it had very much been left behind, even in the climate of the welfare state introduced by Attlee. And this, of course, causes an enormous amount of social unrest and resentment towards the political elite of the country, as well as the other citizens in different towns, many of whom hadn't realised the extent of the damage to Liverpool because of the propaganda given by Churchill's government. But despite the social and economic problems that many Scousers faced, culturally, there was a renaissance, not just in Liverpool, but generally the 60s could not have been more different from the socially conservative 40s and 50s and Victorian throwbacks. And Liverpool is very much at the heart of a youth-driven counterculture. Because of the lack of jobs in the city, people pour their efforts into the arts, in music especially. And the artwork that comes out of Liverpool from bands like Love is inspired by LSD and more colourful than artwork had been previously. I've got a few examples in the back of this slide, and I'll talk about art and music as a historical source in the seminar. But social attitudes change, and we can see this in music and fashion. And of course, the most famous example of this kind of hallucinogenic counterculture are the Beatles, who come from Liverpool and become, without doubt, the biggest musical and cultural phenomenon that the world had ever seen. They revolutionized the music industry, especially the Sgt. Pepper's album, which becomes a global phenomenon and isn't just huge in Britain, but in India and America as well. And the Beatles, being from Liverpool, causes enormous amount of civic pride in Scousers. And lots of the singles have references to Liverpool, the most famous of which I've included on the 1969 double single, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields. Penny Lane being a road in Mossley Hill, which is a poor area of Liverpool where the Beatles used to meet to get the bus. The other example on this double single was Strawberry Fields. Now, Strawberry Fields was originally a Salvation Army property and a children's home in Liverpool where John Lennon used to play as a child. So on the Magical Mystery Tour, which becomes an enormous commercial success, you have lots of references to Liverpool, but specifically working class Liverpool, people getting the bus on Penny Lane, children who didn't have a home going to the Salvation Army. But Strawberry Fields as well becomes a drug rehabilitation centre. And the links between drugs and working class counterculture in Liverpool becomes massively influential globally. So while socially and economically there are a lot of problems in Liverpool, the rest of the world is all of a sudden paying an enormous amount of attention to the city for the arts that are coming out of it. But it's not just music and the arts where Liverpool is thriving. What you get is Liverpool Football Club emerging as one of the great sporting powers. And this is really driven by a man called Bill Shankly, who's one of kind of Liverpool Football Club's great heroes. In 1959, Liverpool Football Club had really reached new lows. They were in the old second division. And in 1959, they'd been knocked out of the FA Cup by lowly Worcester City. And Liverpool's football ground, Anfield, really acted as a physical metaphor for what was going on with the whole city. By the time Bill Shankly became manager in the early 60s, Anfield had fallen into utter disrepair. Shankly famously quipped that it looked as though the Germans had visited Anfield. The pitch was of poor quality. They couldn't water it. There was no irrigation. The stands had moss growing through the cracks, famously. And there was an apathy surrounding the club. People didn't have much money at that time period. And they didn't want to spend it watching a team that was performing poorly. Now, Bill Shankly revolutionizes the club. He is a Scottish working class man. He brings new approaches to the psychology of sport. And it is under him that Liverpool first begin to, firstly, they get promoted into the first division, and then they win it in 64. They win the FA Cup in 65. And this rejuvenates the club and attendances skyrocket. And Shankly is an avid socialist, and he is a very charismatic orator, and he becomes a famous figure, not just in Liverpool, but throughout England. But of course, being Scottish, there is strong anti-English and anti-conservative sentiment in his rhetoric, and he strikes a relationship up with the fans who really not just take on his sporting ideologies, but his political and social messages as well. And one of the big things he does is reinforce the idea that supporters matter and that they are the 12th man on the pitch and they can influence games. And this gives autonomy to Scousers who feel as though they've lost it in the rest of their life. And a very specific subsection and community that forms is Copites. One of the stands in Anfield is called the Kop, which is based on Spion Kop, which was a mountain in South Africa. And there was a famous victory that took place there for the British Empire. So there's almost like a military element that gets introduced, this social military element to playing sport and giving power back to people in the Kop who referred to themselves as Copites, the die-hard supporters of Liverpool Football Club. And after Shankly retires in 74, another socialist takes over Liverpool, and he is called Bob Paisley. who was from a mining town in the northeast. And these working class heroes really give hope to lots of people in Liverpool that you can still become successful despite a lack of social and economic prospects. And it's not just in Britain where Liverpool are successful under Paisley, although they do win the first division in 76, 77, 79, 80, 81, and 83, which is an extraordinary level of consistency and success. But they extend their success to to the European competitions as well. And in 1977, 1978, and 1981, they win the European Cup, which is now known as the Champions League. So, like the Beatles, Liverpool Football Club is putting the city on the map, and the heroes of these teams, it's not just the managers who are working class heroes, the players are as well. You get Emlyn Hughes, Phil Thompson, Kenny Dalglish, Graham Souness, Alan Hansen. They're all from working class towns in Scotland, Ireland, and England, and they really become heroes. And this civic pride is reintroduced to the city. And the idea of them conquering Europe in Rome, in Wembley, and Paris really takes off. That Liverpool, despite everything, are successful. So, because of the music, because of the sport, there is interest in Liverpool, and people want to visit Anfield, and they want to visit the Cavern Club where the Beatles played their early gigs. So what you get is, despite industry leaving, there is still interest, there is still pride in being a Scouser. However, when Liverpool win their third European Cup in 1981, there is wider troubles that are increasingly getting worse in Liverpool. In 81, you get the Toxteth riots, which are extensive, and you may not have heard of them. You might have heard of the Brixton riots of 81, which were in London and a result of police brutality against the African and Jamaican communities that formed there. But you also get the Toxteth riots, which were often underrepresented in the national press. National employment in England reaches a new high by 1981. And even within that, in Liverpool, it is disproportionately high. And within that disproportionately high city of Liverpool, you get an area called Toxteth, where unemployment is even more disproportionately high. And social tensions bubble there over the 70s. And mirroring the Brixton riots of April, clashes happen in Liverpool. And because of the social tensions that exist there, police really have to crack down. And the Merseyside police, who are given powers by the Conservative government, become the enemy of Scousers. The establishment is increasingly the enemy of the people of Liverpool. And there's a famous example of Leroy Cooper, who's a black Scouser, who is badly beaten in public. And this leads to widespread rioting. And it really can't be overstated how violent the Toxteth riots were. 500, I just realized I put 5,000 arrested on this slide. It was 500 Scousers were arrested. 500 policemen are injured as well. It is the first time outside of Ireland that gas grenades are used against the British public because of the ferocity of the violence. 70 buildings in Toxteth are burnt down. 100 cars destroyed. One of the most famous methods used by the Scousers during the Toxteth riots is burning milk floats and launching them towards the battalions of police. So it is very violent. And it just goes to show how much anger and discontent there is in Liverpool towards the British establishment. And one of the most kind of famous examples of um, uh, death in the riots is the death of David Moore, who was a disabled man in his early 20s. Because of the increasingly violent tactics demonstrated by the rioters, police respond harshly and they start driving Land Rovers into the crowds of people who are rioting. And David Moore ends up dying. However, the police officers are cleared of manslaughter the following year. This causes outrage and only goes to drive a greater wedge between the people of Liverpool, police, and the establishment who supported them. The Conservative government has to get in police from Birmingham and Devon and the rest of the country to deal with this situation. And it only goes to perpetuate the idea of Scousers being disobedient, aggressive, and unemployed. So Liverpool's national image is continually being damaged in this time period. And it is in the early 80s, as a response to the Toxteth riots, that anti conservatism in Liverpool grows and reaches its zenith. Um, Sir Geoffrey Howe, who is the Chancellor of England at the time, famously writes a letter, a report to Margaret Thatcher about how to deal with the Toxteth riots. And in it, he says that it would be like trying to make water flow uphill to make Liverpool economically viable again. He recommends to Margaret Thatcher that there is a managed decline of the city, that instead of putting money into the community, they should take money out of it, as it is a lost cause. And the people of Liverpool don't deserve extra support, and that emerging new centres like in Birmingham in the West Midlands, and it would be more economically sensible to put money into those communities. And whilst Thatcher isn't the individual who comes up with this term, managed decline, and in fact sends Michael Heseltine to Liverpool to come up with suggestions on how to improve relations, she doesn't end up doing anything. She doesn't put money in to the town, and she becomes the face of the enemy of Scousers. And by the time she leaves office, there isn't a single Conservative MP in Liverpool. So we go from a Conservative trading stronghold at the start of the century to not a single Conservative MP in the city by the time Thatcher leaves. And Conservatives are seen as the root of many of these evils and the reason why money is not being poured into Liverpool. And we'll look at the report that Howe sends to Thatcher in the seminar. So if you want to have a look at that before, that would be helpful. So you can see Liverpool has drastically changed in the 81 years of the 21st century. My concluding points for this lecture are on this slide. You can pause and have a look at them. But before we meet, I'd like you to do the following things. I want you to read Paul Cooper's Competing Explanations of the Merseyside Riots of 1981, because there are lots of different ideas about why they kicked off and what the origins of them were. And I want you to think about the following questions. One, why was there so much unemployment in Liverpool in the 40s and 50s? Two, why was there not more investment in the city during this period? Why didn't the political elite try harder to rejuvenate the city? Three, what was the role of football in the community, and why did Bill Shankly have a wider impact on the city? And I'm going to put a few documentaries about Bill Shankly on Moodle for you to look at if you want. And number four, why did the Toxteth riots take place, and what was the lasting impact of them? So have a think about those questions, and we'll discuss them in more detail and the ideas of what a Scouser is in the seminar. Thank you.